So today we're talking about strategies for engaging students in the classroom with group work. Give you an idea of kind of a short outline. I'll do a short presentation. I'm not going to talk a long time. And then have plenty of time for questions and discussion. There will be a recording of the webinar available from Teaching and Learning Commons, and another engagement session coming up 2 weeks from today, same time, on experiential learning, learning by doing. So just a short outline here of what we're going to do. I'll give you a short bio on me, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the benefits of group work. If you're here, you probably already know them, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. And then some of the challenges, and we'll talk specifically about conflict, about procrastination, about leveling the workload, and about communication. So those are some of the main topics we'll discuss. Everything we talk about isn't going to apply to you, but hopefully you get a couple of little nuggets that you can adapt and you can use. If you would, in the questions section, if you would put what classes you're teaching or thinking about teaching or applying this to, it might be helpful, and you can post questions in there as well. We'll address those closer to the end. So who is this guy? This is actually a picture of me teaching. It's unusual to get pictures of yourself teaching. One of my students actually took this and sent it to me. I graduated from West Virginia University in 1987. I have degrees in mechanical engineering and a bachelor's degree also in German. I worked for more than 20 years in industry, mostly in the plastics industry, making mostly durable good plastic components for automotive applications, lawn and garden, HVAC, things like that. I returned to WVU in 2005 to get my master's and PhD because I wanted to teach. I am now starting my 7th year in freshman engineering. Mostly I teach engineering 101, 102, and a study abroad that I do. Won a couple of teaching awards, and my main focus is on kinesthetic and experiential learning. My main philosophy is to teach beyond the book, not just what this is, but why do we learn that and how do we actually use it? So what are some of the benefits of group work? Well, the old model of the sage on the stage really doesn't apply anymore. It's tempting, especially in large groups, to lecture, but there is a better way, and teaching in groups allows your students to collaborate. You get better outcomes. It allows you to assign more challenging problems than you would typically get to assign to individuals if everybody was going to do the work individually. It helps improve critical thinking. We want them to know critical thinking. In order to do that, we have to teach them critical thinking. And it more closely resembles workplace type of environment. So it is tempting to lecture, especially in large classes, but when you're lecturing, you're not really teaching, you're really presenting, and your students become more of an audience than they do your students, and there's not a good way to get feedback from them. So if you find that you're lecturing just to cover the material, find some other ways that you can cover the material by moving some of it out of class. Leave some of the fundamentals to the book. Maybe do a partial flipping of some material. You have to read this outside of class because we're doing this in class. Have some required reading or required material that they cover outside of it. And then the group work requires that they already know that because they're going to be using the material. We've all seen this, 10 guys watching and one guy doing the work. There are challenges with group work. It's not as simple as it seems, and an uneven workload is one of them. Either one person doing all the work, or more typically, you have one or two who ride everybody else's coattails. We'll talk a little bit about how to address that and ways that you can get everybody to level the workload. Procrastination is human nature, and everybody does it. It's a thing that you need to work on, and we have some strategies for that. Conflicts, scheduling conflicts, team conflicts, just conflict in general can be an issue, and we'll talk a little bit about separating out different types of conflict and how to address those. And communication is also one of the challenges. So let's talk a little bit first about this conflict. Teaming skills are really important, and you can take whole seminars, multi-day seminars on teaming skills, but most of them boil into this stages of forming, storming, norming, and performing. I'll cover these kind of briefly. I can't give them as much justice as they deserve, but I want to talk a little bit about them because this is really where the conflict resolution comes in, and it really comes in the forming stage. You need to set the stage in the beginning, and a good way to do that is to set up some sort of an agreement with the teams. We call them team charters, and this is an agreement of the rules before everybody even gets started on the work. So the typical things that you'll find in a team charter or a team agreement is they get to pick a team name, who's going to be on the team, how they're going to communicate with each other, how they're going to make the decisions. And the really important part of the teaming agreement or team charter, whatever it is you call it, is the expectations from everybody. Who's going to, about what their attendance expectations are going to be, how they're going to behave, and really importantly, what are the consequences if they don't do that. This is where everybody nods their head and says, yes, I'm going to go to all the meetings, and if I don't go to all the meetings, it's going to be okay to dock my grade and kick me out of the group and lower my scores. I'm okay with that. It's really important to get them to agree with that later, because later, if they don't, this is where your conflict resolution groundwork is laid out. So it's easy to kind of skip this forming stage and say, yeah, okay, we're together, we're a group, now move on. But it's really important to do this kind of formally. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it is important to do it right, because the very next stage is conflict, the storming stage, and it's important to recognize that there is good conflict and bad conflict, and actually, this is why we do group work, is because of good conflict. And that is conflict about the topic itself. What's the design? What are the features? What does it have to do? Can it come in 5 colors, or does it have to come in 10? What are the things about the project that we're working on? And this is where the collaboration and compromise and communication within groups is really learned. And so having this type of conflict is really good, so long as people can share ideas and work them out. Because bad conflict is usually more about the effort, about the commitment that people have, whether or not they care about it, whether or not they're doing a good enough job. And so this kind of bad conflict, you want to try to avoid and move on to the next stage as much as you can. And this is where having your team charter really helps. Norming is where people start to really get down to work, and not everybody on the team will get there at the same time, and not all teams will get there at the same time. So it's important to recognize when you're working with groups that sometimes people are ready to move on from conflict and get down to actually doing business. Others still have a bone to pick. And the last stage is performing. This is where you want to get to, because this is where everybody is rowing together to try to get to where they want to go. And this is where the teams that really do well get to this performing stage, and not all teams even get there. So it helps if you have that forming stage set up, so the expectations, everybody understands what the expectations are, and we work through some good conflict to get to where we can really work on something great. Procrastination. Everybody waits till the last minute to do things. This is human nature. Faculty does this, students do this, we do it in industry. This is it's kind of human nature. So some people are more averse to procrastination and they get started right away. Others will wait till the last minute and cram. Fighting procrastination, well, the way that if you give them 10 weeks to do a project, they'll wait till 9.5 and start. What you want to do is have interim deliverables. You want to have regular reviews every week, every 2 weeks, where they are doing some kind of a review. And that can depend entirely on the kind of course that you're teaching or the kind of discipline that you're teaching. They can be milestones, stage gates, prototypes, design freeze, rough draft, whatever kind of works for the discipline that you're teaching. You need to have some interim deliverables. You need to be at least this far by at least this date, and then you have to have them turn those in and check them. I like to have weekly or sometimes bi-weekly reports of some kind. I'll have them do a progress report or even just their meeting minutes from their meetings. We all take meeting minutes at all of our meetings. We should be teaching our students to do that. We actually do in our department. I can tell you, when I graduated and I went off to industry, they said, hey, Hamrick, would you take the minutes for this meeting? I had no idea what they meant. I didn't know what that meant. It's a great way to make sure that they're actually recording what they're doing, and you collect those on a periodic basis. This also helps a lot with accountability. It makes sure that everybody is doing what they're doing, and that they're recording that. Everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Everybody's attending the meetings. And if they're not, this is where you can really see that. 3 weeks in, Larry hasn't been to a meeting since the first one. Is there a problem? And you can contact Larry and make sure that he's working with Curly and Mo. Okay, so planning is also a big part of this, and depending on how your discipline plans its work, you need to have some kind of structured planning. In engineering, we use Gantt charting, but you can use any kind of goal setting or planning structure that kind of works for you. But students need guidance on this. They're not used to doing this, especially in the first 2 years. They've never really had to do a lot of planning, and so by the time they get to their senior year and they're trying to plan out their senior project, even then they usually don't have a huge amount of experience with it. So they need a little guidance in how to plan. And another really important way that teams work well together is if they reflect on their own performance periodically, every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on the length of your project. Maybe think about doing this 2 times, divide the project into 2 or 3 points. And this comes from the Norman Schwarzkopf method, which is, what are we doing well that we should keep doing? What are we doing that is not adding any value and we should stop doing, or things that we're not doing and we should start? And what are we doing but not as well as we can, and how can we do better, very specifically? So it's really good if teams can reflect on their own performance and see how well we're doing, and kind of have their own little mini retreat to do this reflection. Especially, this is especially true in longer projects. If you're doing a semester-long capstone type of project, it's really important that they have the ability to do some kind of team reflection. Evening out the workload. This starts to show up in their regular reporting. If everybody is not pulling their weight, you begin to see that Larry just is not doing not coming to the meetings or not contributing to the meetings. There are a lot of cultural differences with these as well. So those are those you might want to look into, because some cultures kind of wait to be told what to do. Other cultures jump in and do it. So there can be cultural differences that can affect this. But it shows up in your regular reporting if one of the wheels isn't carrying its weight. Sometimes you'll get a member who kind of does everything and pushes everybody out of the way. You can usually address this by discussing it with the group. But this is a little less common. What I tend to find a lot more of is what I call minimal members, where they do just enough to keep the other members off their back, but they're not really contributing at the level that they could be or that they should be. This is where laying the groundwork with your team charter is really important. If you've had them create rules that they will enforce, then ask them to enforce their own rules. And if the teams are enforcing these rules, it lets the professor off the hook to an extent, but also these are your rules. You agreed to having your grade lowered if you didn't come to the meetings, and the meeting minutes document that you're not going to the meetings. You said in the team charter you would, and this really gives you a good way to affect a student's grade, or sometimes just to threaten to affect their grade, will have an effect on it. So this is where laying that groundwork with that team charter is really important. And then check it up with the regular reporting and enforce the rules if not. There are some other things that you can do to level the workload. One is to have some individual components that you, as the instructor, are going to read and grade that is separate from the group work. If the entire grade is based just on group work, everybody will try to, do the minimum amount that gets them where they want to go. But if you have an individual component, your individual project grade is based on this, then you're more likely to do a better job on that. So this can be a research paper, some individualized testing, or individualized reporting. And the way we set this up, and this has worked pretty well, is that you have to do your part of the preliminary research work, or you can't really continue with the project because you don't really have anything to contribute to the rest of the team. So if you don't complete the research work, then you're not really permitted to complete the rest of the project, and that will really hurt their grade. And then that's not the team, the other students, enforcing that rule. That's a rule coming from the instructor, and it tends to carry more weight, and then you can enforce that. And with this, I tend to get much better compliance. They know that their entire project is going to suffer if they don't do their individual part of it. Another thing you can do is peer reviews. I've had mixed results with peer reviews. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you'll get, everybody did a wonderful job and it was great, even though you know that somebody wasn't. You'll sometimes get differences of opinion. So-and-so did great and other people thought he didn't. So peer reviews, they might work for you, and I would recommend that. And another thing that has worked for me is to make it easier to fire somebody. A big difference between industry and academia when it comes to group work is when I have a group of students that are in my class, I have to put every single student on a team. They have to be part of a group. It's a zero-sum game. In industry, that's not the case. I don't have to put everybody on the group and in a group. And my group of people that I can theoretically pick from is the 6 billion people on the planet. It doesn't have to be the closed set of people who are enrolled in that class. And so I have more flexibility. If I make it easier to remove a team member, then they're more likely to do it, and other students are more likely to step up so that they don't get fired. Because if the consequences for getting removed from the group are very severe, if you get removed from your group, you're going to fail the project, which means you're probably going to fail the course. And this has serious long-range consequences. Students are less likely to sort of do that to each other because it has a really serious consequence. But if the consequence isn't so bad, it's a little easier to kind of move to another group. The flip side of it is, if you're not happy in your group, you can find another one and move to it without a lot of effort. They're more likely to try to keep everybody in the group happier. This has worked fairly well. It's just the concept of being able to move groups, and it's not such a serious effect to remove somebody from a group, has helped everybody to find a way to step up a little bit better. Communication is another issue. And technology can help with communication, especially today. Meetings can be electronic. You don't have to all be in the same room at the same time. Hey, we're doing that right this minute. Everybody's not in the same room, and yet we're having an effective meeting. The students use a lot of group chats. They use GroupMe and Viber and a lot of WhatsApp, and there's a lot of other types of group chats that they all use, and they're used to that. And eCampus can help you out here. There are issues with eCampus, but it does some things really well, and this is one of the things that it does great. You set up the groups in eCampus, and then you set up some of their communications within it. You can set it up so that the group can communicate with each other within the group, so they can't say, well, I didn't have his number, so I couldn't contact him. You can't get that an excuse because they're able to email each other within the group from within eCampus. And that's helpful, especially early on. You can post your notes and presentations and assignments and announcements and emails out to the group using eCampus. It also simplifies the grading pretty significantly, because if they turn in a group assignment, you make a group assignment for, let's just say, one of these interim reports. They upload the interim report to eCampus, and then when you give the group a grade, it automatically goes into everybody in the group. If you want to change one person's individual group within that assignment, you can do that. You can say, well, everybody gets 10 points except Larry, who wasn't coming. He'll get 5. You're able to do that as well. There are a lot of group communication functions within eCampus, and I use it really very extensively, so it's a good tool for that. Okay, so that's what I have as far as presentation goes. We'll stop and do some questions. If you could, go into the questions area, write me what I like to call a minute paper. That is just one thing from this that you thought was useful or helpful, or of something that you're going to give it a try. We can also answer some questions. There is a recording of the webinar if you know somebody who thinks might benefit from it, and then we'll have another one of these in 2 weeks.
Okay, my question is, do you allow team members to self-select their group, or do you purposefully arrange them into groups?
Actually, we usually do 2 projects, and we dictate the first one and let them self-select the second one. But it's really, I mean, there's pros and cons to both of it. On the one hand, we do have people that say, hey, when you are going to be working in an industry or wherever, you're not always going to have your choice of who to work for. The flip side of that is that, well, to an extent I do, because I don't necessarily have to work for that company. I can work for somebody else, and I can pick, maybe not the individuals, but I can pick the group that they pick them from, and I prefer to work with people who are really good at what they do. So to answer your question, it's really very much it's kind of your own personal choice. Generally speaking, it lets you off the hook to an extent, to a great extent, if they've picked their own groups. If they get terrible group members, well, you put Larry, Moe, and Curly on your team. And if Larry, Moe, and Curly don't do a very good job, well, you should have picked your team better. If they've got Larry, Moe, and Curly on their team, and you put them on their team, then they'll blame you for having a bad group, and they will also that might also affect your SEIs on that. So for the bigger ones, I usually let them pick their groups. In the end, all things considered, I let them pick their own groups. But I can understand why people don't, but I let them pick. Okay, go ahead.
Do you look over the students' contracts before they come into force? I'm assuming he means before they're need to be enforced.
Yes, so I do. It's an assignment. Their team charter. Give them a scaffold for the team charter of the things that I expect for it to be in it, a typical kind of format that I expect it to be in, and the kinds of things that I expect them to address. And they don't have to address every single bullet item on my list, but these are the things that I typically expect. And then, yes, there's a grade, and if they don't do it, or don't do parts of it, their grade is lowered for that. And then I tell them to go back and do it again, because I think that it's such an important part of the teaming process that I want them to do it. And so because of that, the answer is yes, I do go back and read them and grade them, and they get a grade based on that. It's not a lot of points, but it's something, I make it worth their while. So yes, I do. Good question.
And Todd, with that, let me follow up with something. I would assume that if there are issues with the contract, that would give you an opportunity to address anything like that. Anything they're neglecting or anything that may seem to be inappropriate. Is that the case?
Yeah, it really is. And if there's something that's inappropriate, also it needs to be realistic, because you can't expect, especially for a semester-long project, every single person to be at every single meeting every single time. And if that's the expectation, then that's really not realistic. That's why we do meeting minutes and why we do regular performance reviews at some point to say, you know, because everybody can't be there every single time. And so making sure that that it's reasonable, because then it's hard to enforce an unreasonable rule. So yes, I had to go back through and make sure that they're reasonable and appropriate. Exactly.
Yeah, thanks.
I've also heard team names that were inappropriate, and so if they've got, you know, team names that are, you know, really inappropriate, they sometimes kind of make a joke out of that, and okay, you can have a little joke, but if it's gonna be really something offensive or really inappropriate, you try to address that early on.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, Lori asked, I teach online in graduate programs.
Mm-hmm.
So students are all over, and universally, they hate group work. Any special tips?
We teach our Engineering 101 as an online class, and sometimes those folks are scattered all over the place as well. So if you have something where they can, where the pieces all go together, it really can be helpful. I saw one, it didn't really work all that well, but it was a great idea. And that was something called a band in a box, where everybody was supposed to build some kind of an instrument, and then they all together played some kind of music. In actual practice, they didn't play very good music, but they could at least work together on this thing. But really, if you can have them using some things like GoToMeeting, the eCampus has Collaborate. I haven't used that myself, but partly because it's really limited as to number of people that you can have involved. But I think having some kind of face-to-face interface is really helpful and useful. So if they have a way that they can do that, I prefer when I can to use an eCampus or a WVU type of product rather than a commercial product, simply because I don't really like to require them to have, say, for example, a Facebook account or something like that. So to answer your question on that, it is harder whenever they're scattered out, but with electronic communication the way it is today, a lot of that can just go away, and they can use something like a GoToMeeting type of product. They can talk to each other, and they don't necessarily all have to be in the same place at the same time. This is easier to do with today's communication than ever before. So a lot of that excuse kind of goes away. And if they see the benefits of working with people and collaborating with people who aren't necessarily in the same room with them, there are benefits to doing that, especially if those people are really far away. You got different time zones and things. It's challenging to get them together. But I've worked with people who were, you know, in Europe, and we're here, and I have to be able to work with them. We had 2 or 3 hours of overlap of time. You know, when I would come in the morning, we would check and see if I needed to communicate with somebody, because they'd already been at work for 6 or 7 hours, and that wasn't unusual at all. And so you pick up the phone and call them. So to answer that, as far as communication goes, it's much easier to do now than before, and so I think that it's okay to require that.
This is Beth. How much class time do you find the organizational side of the teamwork takes?
We don't take a huge amount of time for the organizational side of it. When they first get their groups together, a lot of times I'll give them 5 or 10 minutes at the end of a class period, and they exchange phone numbers and things. So as far as like organizing the groups themselves, I don't spend very much class time on that. I spend a good bit of class time on the teaming skills. That's a full class period, a full 50-minute class period. And there again, I don't stand and lecture at them. I break them up and make them do stuff. So not a huge amount on the organizational side, more on the teaching how to be a good team side.
Beth says the creation of a team charter is something I'd not heard of before, but it sounds extremely useful.
Thank you. Yes, that is a great tool, because it's really what you can. It's the hammer you can go back and hit them with later. So it's a really good tool for that reason.
Okay, so Lori asks, what is the best number in a group?
The magic number seems to be about 4. And that's from my own experience, from the experiences here, and from other research that I've been involved with. I did a training just not too long ago, and the magic number seems to be 4. I don't always have classes that are evenly divisible by 4, but I'll let them go 3 to 5. And that seems to work pretty well as well. I've done 3 to 5, and the nice thing about that is then if you go to 6, I'm not going to let you have a group of 6. It's just too many. So if you're going to go to 6, then break into two teams of 3. If you didn't break them into teams of 3, they were going to break themselves into 2 teams of 3, and they might all still be one big group, but they're not actually going to be working together. Teams of 3, it depends a little on what they're doing also. If they're doing really complex stuff where they have to do a lot of physical building, then a bigger team might be good. But the magic number seems to be as much as possible 4 per group.
Okay, I'm trying to track this. Lori says agree on number. We have 80 in a class, so that makes for lots of groups.
Yes, it does. Large classes. We covered that in the last webinar. You're welcome to go back and check on it. And yes, it's big groups. Big classes are a challenge, and so it's difficult to manage that number of groups. But using your technology, using eCampus to help you out with managing that number of groups. And if they can do some of the work outside, we always do an expo at the end of the, I didn't talk about that in the presentation, but we do an expo at the end of the semester that our first semester course, the 101 course, does, and they all present their final projects. And knowing that they're going to be presenting this project to lots of people and their peers are going to see what they do has really benefited quite a bit. That's a good way to do it. And I'll probably talk about that more 2 weeks from now when I talk about experiential learning. But I've had students contact their parents and have their parents come and see what they did because they're really proud of the work that they did. And when they're that proud of the work that they did, then it says a lot. So yeah, managing large groups can be tough. It's our large classes. So but group work is a good way to do it because then you don't have as many to have to contend with, and sometimes you can meet just with the group leaders instead of trying to meet with all 80 of them. If you've got 20 groups, then you're meeting with 20 people instead of 80 people.
Okay, Todd. Marianne had raised her hand.
Yeah.
I had muted her, so go ahead, Marianne.
Go ahead, Marianne.
So you were talking about all these different strategies for getting the groups to work, but what about the assessment at the end? I mean, while you have this contract on what the penalties will be if they do not meet the team charter,
right?
How does the assessment side of it go?
Okay, good question on that. We don't really we don't assess that so much because if the group is working together, then the product that they produce will be a good product. The team, the peer reviews can assess that to an extent, and that's usually about 10% of the total project. But then I'm not assessing that in the total project. I assess it as they go along in their team meetings and if they're not participating, but it's really more of a guideline to try to get everybody participating and doing their part. And if they're not, then their grades will be lowered. I can, especially if the rest of the group says, look, you know, Harpo, Zeppo, and Marco were doing great, but the other guy, he just wasn't doing his part. I can take Groucho out and lower his grade, and I have done that. And it's usually in some kind of agreement with the rest of the team, and very often with Groucho himself. He'll go, you know, I didn't do my part, and I deserve a little bit lower grade. And I have had that conversation with students.
So I'd imagine it's a very difficult conversation if it comes towards the end and the student who was not participating says, no, this isn't fair. Like how it's just one of those difficult conversations that's always tough to have.
Yeah, it is sometimes. It is sometimes. But this is why having laid the groundwork is really important. If you've got documentation of what they've been doing all along, you've got meeting minutes from every single week, and I can see your participation and your attendance at every meeting. And if you made it to 3 out of 8 meetings, that tells me that you weren't participating very much. And this is documented. This is why it's really important to document these things, to set up the rules ahead of time and then document it with periodic reviews, like meeting minutes or every other week reviews, so that it documents who's there and who's not, and that really gives you a lot better way of saying, well, you only made it to half the meetings and you only did half the work, so you only deserve half the grade. If it's just sort of, well, it kind of felt like he didn't do very much and he just wasn't very nice, and then it's a little harder to do by just by just how it feels. If you got it documented, then it's much better.
Okay. One follow-up to that, though, because I've dealt with this a little bit, but students with special needs, those with anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And certainly in your industry and in mine, I'm in med lab science, we assess and we tell them we have essential functions that they need to meet and they have to be able to communicate with others. But I have had a student recently with anxiety disorder that refused to work in groups.
Okay. Was that on his accommodations?
No.
Then
so I told them they had to do it. So
actually, yes, you have to do that. You can't. They can't make up their own accommodations, and you can only accommodate what is set out in their accommodations from the, I'm going to get the name wrong, the disabilities office. They set out what the accommodations are, and you actually can't create additional accommodations for that person. If they flatly refuse to do it, then you really have no choice but to lower their grade as a consequence.
So I'm just asking if you've ever encountered that.
I have encountered people asking for accommodations that were not part of the accommodations that they that were set out by the disabilities office. And I always tell them, this is what I'm allowed to do, and I can't and won't do anything different. And that really gives you, I can do this and I can't do something else. If you feel that you need to not be able to work in groups, then contact the disabilities office and have that part of your accommodations, then I'll accommodate it.
Yeah, well, our profession is not that big of an issue because we have essential functions that they have to meet as well, which includes the communication in groups. So that's how we dealt with that student of, this is a requirement of the profession. So
it really is. And if you can't do that, I mean, look, I tell my students too, engineering is a team sport. You got to be able to play on teams. And yeah, with what you're doing, it's a team sport. You got to be able to do it in teams. And if you can't, then maybe this isn't the right profession. Maybe a different profession would be better. Although I honestly can't think of any profession where you work entirely by yourself and you never work in groups.
No, I agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, some people say, well, I'm going to go into engineering because people are annoying and I don't want to have to deal with people. Well, people are annoying, but you still have to deal with them, and here's how. And so that's kind of the thing I tell them. But yeah, I've had students who asked for accommodations that weren't in their list, and I'm sorry, I just can't do that because I can't accommodate one thing for one person just because they asked for it.
I want to thank everyone for joining us.
If anybody has anything, you can find me and you can send me an email. I'll be happy to talk.
Okay, thank you for that, Todd, and I hope you found some value in today's and some ideas that you might be able to utilize in your teaching. And I hope that you can join us in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we'll be talking about experiential learning by doing.